What if I told you there's a commander that turns mill into a viable strategy, creates a massive army of robots in the process, and can eventually combo off by casting itself over and over again? The Cyber Controller. For 3 mana plus X in Dimir colors, we get a goofy looking robot you've probably never even heard of before. Whenever the Cyber Controller enters the battlefield, each opponent will have to mill X cards. Now at first glance, this might seem like a pretty standard mill ability, but there is actually a lot more going on here. First of all, this ability gives us a mill win condition sitting right there in the command zone, which will always be available to us. Once we are able to generate huge amounts of mana, or even infinite mana, we can simply dump all of it into the X, and if we can cast them a couple of times with a huge X cost, we can realistically easily win the game by just milling out our opponents. But the real reason this ability is so interesting is the second part of the effect. Whenever any creature card would be milled this way, we get to put it on the battlefield under our control as a face down 2/2 artifact Cyberman creature. So every time we'll be casting our commander, we won't just be milling our opponents. We'll also be building towards a massive board presence. And because the Cyber Controller also has a passive ability that will give a +1/+1 stat boost to all other artifact creatures we control, those Cybermen tokens will actually be 3/3 bodies, which means they can overwhelm the board really quickly. Even casting Cyber Controller with an X cost as low as 3 will already generate you about 3 to 4 of these Cybermen tokens, which will already give you a really solid board state to start protecting yourself with. And once we are able to invest more mana into the X, we will be generating a massive army of Cyber Boys to start threatening our opponent's life totals with. Now that being said, I am fully aware of the fact that mill decks aren't considered a viable strategy, because milling your opponents will usually help them advance their game plan. For example, if you are playing against a reanimator deck, they will love it whenever you do mill their Elesh Norn as a reanimation target. But the Cyber Controller actually bypasses one of the biggest weaknesses of mill decks, because whenever creatures do get milled this way, we will instantly get them under our control as Cyberman creatures, meaning that our opponents won't have access to them anymore at all. Now all of that being said, this isn't actually a dedicated mill deck, not even close. In fact, the only real mill outlet we play in the deck is the Cyber Controller himself. What we're really playing here is more of a Dimir control / combo deck. The plan is to ramp into the Cyber Controller, generate a bunch of these Cyberman artifact tokens, then sacrifice all of these tokens to generate a huge amount of mana, which will allow us to cast our commander again with even more mana into the X, and then just keep repeating this process, which will eventually result in you either milling your opponents out or just taking over the game with your huge army of Cybermen. It's honestly one of the most unique builds that I've ever done, and I can guarantee you have never seen a deck like this one. And a small little side note, at the time of recording this video, I'm pretty sick, so apologies in advance if my voice is sounding kinda goofy. As I do in all my videos, I will be going over every single card in the deck and explaining why I decided to include it. This video is divided up into 6 categories: the main engine of the deck, the mana acceleration and cost reduction, support, card draw, protection and interaction, and the lands. Now before we dive into the rest of the list, let's start by talking about the main engine of this deck. While the Cyber Controller will generate us an army of Cybermen, these are the cards that will allow us to convert those cards into the mana we need to go for an actual win. Ashnod's Altar and Krark Clan Ironworks, which I will be abbreviating throughout the video as KCI. Both of these artifacts will allow us to sacrifice either creatures or artifacts to add 2 colorless mana to our mana pool for every sacrifice. There's no setup required, no hoops to jump through, just simple activated abilities we can use on instant speed. And honestly, just these 2 cards alone are the entire reason I got interested in building this deck in the first place. So let me just give you a quick example of what a typical game with this deck will look like. Early on, we want to play a couple of mana rocks and then ramp into the Cyber Controller, usually around turn 4 or turn 5. Let's say we cast them for 6 mana with X being 3. Each opponent will then have to mill 3 cards, totaling in a total of 12 cards being milled, which usually will result in about 4 Cybermen for us. Then we want to tutor up our Ashnod's Altar or our KCI, and that's where things get really interesting, because then we will be able to sacrifice those 4 Cybermen tokens and the Cyber Controller himself, which will then generate us 10 colorless mana. Since our commander will go back to the command zone whenever he dies, we can just recast him and dump all of the mana we just generated into his X cost, which means our opponents will have to mill even more cards and we will get to generate even more Cybermen tokens. And from there on we can just keep repeating this process in the same turn. Sacrifice all of the Cybermen and Cyber Controller for mana and just keep casting him over and over again with more and more mana pumped into the X. And we can keep repeating this for as long as we have the colored mana available to pay for the pips of Cyber Controller, which will eventually result in a game win, either by milling out your opponents or just swinging at them with your huge army of Cybermen. Now most of the deck is built around supporting this engine, helping us accelerate into it, tutoring up our key combo pieces, and generating us additional value whenever we are going through this loop. I really had to show this interaction first, because now you know how the engine works, all of the other card choices in this deck will make a lot more sense. Now let's get into the mana acceleration and the cost reduction. Since the amount of mana we can pump into the X is incredibly important in this deck, generating huge amounts of mana is absolutely crucial to our strategy. These cards will allow us to ramp out the Cyber Controller really early, scale up the amount of mana we can pump into his X cost, and will make sure we can keep recasting our commander whenever the engine is online. And let's get started with our cost reducers. Chief Engineer, a 2-drop creature that will give any artifact spell we cast a convoke mechanic, meaning we can tap our creatures to help pay for the mana cost of those spells. As you will see later, we are playing a huge amount of artifacts and this effect will apply to about 40% of the entire deck. And more importantly, it will also apply to Cyber Controller himself. And it just scales incredibly well with all of the Cybermen we'll be generating, essentially turning all of them into some sort of mana dorks, helping us get out our value artifacts really early, while also scaling up the amount of mana we are able to dump into the Cyber Controller. And a fun fact about the Convoke mechanic is that it doesn't care about summoning sickness. You can just drop your commander and generate a bunch of Cybermen, and on the same turn they came down, you will instantly be able to tap them to convoke out any artifact in your hand. Ethereum Sculptor, a 2-mana artifact creature that will passively reduce the cost of any other artifact spell you cast by 1 generic mana. Arguably one of the most efficient creatures for any sort of artifact deck. I can guarantee you whenever you do have this card in your opening hand and are able to drop it on turn 2, you are going to have a really good time, because you will be able to follow up with a huge amount of mana rocks which will barely cost you any mana. It will up the cost efficiency of any other artifact in this deck, and for as long as this card remains on the battlefield, every time you cast your Cyber Controller, the value of X will be increased by 1. And a card with a really similar effect is Cloud Key, a 3-mana artifact that whenever it enters a battlefield will make us name a card type, and obviously we'll always be naming artifacts. And just like the previous card, it will reduce the mana cost of any artifact we play by 1 generic mana. While it is a little less cost efficient, costing you 1 mana more, the fact that this card isn't a creature makes it really hard to deal with for your opponents. And just like I mentioned in the intro, since we are playing a total of 36 artifacts in this deck plus the Cyber Controller, the amount of value cost reduction cards like this one will generate you is absolutely insane. Semblance Anvil, another 3-mana cost reduction artifact that will give you a massive cost reduction of 2 generic mana, making it into the best cost reducer in the entire deck. Now obviously that crazy amount of efficiency does come with a downside, and that is that this card has the imprint mechanic, meaning that whenever it enters a battlefield we will have to exile an artifact card from our hand, giving us some sort of card disadvantage. Now that being said, setting yourself back 1 card for an explosive effect like this one is always going to be worth it. It will allow you to cast all of your 2-mana mana rocks for absolutely free, which will trigger a ton of synergies in this deck. You will be able to cast your combo pieces like your Ashnod's Altar for only 1 1 generic mana, which will make it incredibly easy to set up any sort of combo line, and the value of X on Cyber Controller will be increased by 2 thanks to this card's effect. Now let's dive into some of the more fancy and unique acceleration cards we're playing in this deck. Elementalist's Palette, a 3 mana rock that will tap for 1 mana of any color, which already is some pretty okay value, but whenever we cast any spell with X in its cost, we get to put 2 charge counters on this artifact. And whenever we then activate its other ability, we will get to add 1 colorless mana to our mana pool for every charge counter it has on itself. But we'll only be able to spend that mana on any spell that has an X in its cost. And this card is just perfect for what we're trying to achieve in this deck. Since we want to be casting our commander over and over again, this card acts as some sort of an exponential mana rock. Because let's say you did get your Cyber Controller out with this on the battlefield, this card will make the X cost in its next cast go up by 2, then by 4, then by 6, then by 8, which will allow you to really speed up the clock your opponents are on. And since we're also playing 4 other spells with an X in their cost, you can use those to sort of kickstart the amount of charge counters on this card. Pitiless Plunderer, a 4 mana creature that whenever any other creature you control would die will generate you an untapped treasure token. This is just one of those cards that your opponents will have to deal with on the turn it comes down, or it will set you up for some really explosive turns. Either be it due to us swinging with our Cybermen and them dying in combat, or us going through our loop and sacrificing them to any of our sacrifice outlets. Just imagine having both this card and an Ashnod's Altar on the battlefield at the same time. Whenever you now go for a sacrifice, you will get both 2 colorless mana and the untapped treasure token, which will give you an incredible amount of resources to dump into the X of the Cyber Controller. And since the treasures can be sacrificed for actual colored mana, you will always have a way to pay for the colored pips of your commander. Urza, Lord High Artificer, one of the most well-known artifact cards out there, and for good reason. Whenever he enters a battlefield, he will generate an artifact construct token with power and toughness equal to the amount of artifacts you control, which, as you can imagine, in this deck will always have a huge 20/20 or even more stat line, which will serve as a great blocker for any sort of aggressive deck. Whenever your opponents don't have any creatures on the field, you can actually sneak in huge amounts of damage with. And the extra artifact we get on the battlefield does give us a couple more benefits. It will count towards any sort of affinity card we're playing in the deck. It's an extra body we can use to convoke out our spells with Chief Engineer, and it also synergizes incredibly well with Urza's next ability, which is really simple, but it's the best ability on this card. We can tap any untapped artifact we control to add 1 blue mana to our mana pool, which obviously scales incredibly well with the massive amount of Cybermen we'll be generating, turning them into mana dorks. But this ability goes way beyond that. We'll even be able to tap any of our artifacts without a tap ability for mana, like our Semblance Anvil or our Cloud Key. We'll be able to tap our treasure tokens for blue mana without even having to sacrifice them. And what makes this ability truly crazy is the fact that it doesn't care about summoning sickness, because the activated ability is on Urza himself. So you will just be able to cast your Cyber Controller and generate your Cyberman. You will then instantly be able to tap them for a huge amount of blue mana, and if you do have a way to either bounce or sacrifice your Cyber Controller, you can just cast them again and generate even more tokens and keep the loop going. And he also has an activated ability for 5 generic mana that usually, whenever you do have infinite mana available to you, will allow you to put your entire deck into play. Now, I won't really be going into detail, and that's simply because the ability isn't all that relevant in this deck, because once you are able to get to either infinite amount of mana or just a huge amount of mana, we will always be spending it on our commander and not on Urza's ability. Karn, Legacy Reforged, which, just like Urza's construct token, will have power and toughness equal to the amount of artifacts you control. And since this will always be a huge amount, it makes it really hard for your opponents to get your 20 toughness Karn off the field. They won't be able to use any burn spells or any sort of fight effects. And the main reason why this card is included in the deck is his passive ability that will trigger at the beginning of your upkeep, that until the end of turn will add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool for each artifact you do control. Yeah, this will generate you an absurd amount of mana because it takes into account all of our mana rocks, value artifacts, artifact lands, and most importantly, all of the Cybermen we just generated, giving you a huge amount of resources you can use on your next cast of your Cyber Controller. Memnon, the Right Hand, a 5 mana jellyfish creature that will allow you to look at the top card of your library at any given time, while also giving you the ability to cast the top card of your library if it is an artifact. And given the fact that we are playing a total of 36 artifacts in this deck, the odds of you having an artifact on top are pretty big, which will make Memnon give you some sort of pseudo card advantage, allowing you to play with 1 additional card in your hand in the form of the top card of your library. And his second effect functions in exactly the same way as Urza. He will give all artifacts you control the ability that you can tap them to add 1 blue mana to your mana pool, but you'll only be able to spend that blue mana on any card that you're not casting from your hand, which synergizes really well with his first ability, allowing you to tap your artifacts to cast any artifact from the top of your deck, and more importantly, you will also be able to use the blue mana to cast your Cyber Controller, because you're not casting him from your hand, but from the command zone. The Eternity Elevator, a 5 mana spacecraft you are able to tap to add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool, which in itself is already some pretty decent value for this deck. But just like all of the other spacecraft, it also has the station mechanic, meaning that on sorcery speed you can tap any creature you control to add charge counters onto this card equal to the tapped creature's power. And in this deck, stationing any of the spacecraft is a really easy thing to do, since we will always have a huge amount of 3 power Cybermen available to us, which you can even tap on the turn they come down, because the station mechanic also doesn't care about summoning sickness. And once this thing gets to 20 or more charge counters, you get to unlock its final ability, which will add X mana of any color to your mana pool, X being the amount of charge counters on this artifact. Yeah, once this is active, you will be able to tap it for at least 20 mana. And it can be even more because you're not limited in the amount of charge counters you can put on this card, which will enable you to dump an absolutely insane amount of mana into the X of Cyber Controller. And as you will see in a later section, we even do play effects to untap this card and get multiple uses out of it in a single turn, which goes absolutely nuts. Radiant Lotus, a 6 mana artifact we can tap and sacrifice any amount of artifacts we control, and for every single artifact we sacrifice we get to add 3 mana of any given color to our mana pool, a card that will essentially turn every artifact we control into a Black Lotus. Now whenever we do compare this card to our other sacrifice outlets, Ashnod's Altar and KCI, this card is just a straight upgrade, because it will give us 3 mana instead of 2, and it will also give us colored mana we can use to pay for the colored pips of Cyber Controller. The only thing that's holding this card back is the fact that we have to tap it to use its ability, and we can only use it once per turn, so we won't be able to keep using this over and over again and just keep going through the loop on a single turn. That being said, it is still a really explosive effect that sometimes whenever you drop it will generate you about 50 to 60 mana by just sacrificing all of your artifacts. You can sack all of your mana rocks, your Cyberman, your Cyber Controller, the Lotus itself, then just use it to recast your commander. Each one of your opponents will have to mill about 60 cards. You will generate about 100 Cyberman token in the process, and you can just wish your opponents good luck for coming back from that board state. Tezzeret, Master of the Bridge, a 6 mana Dimir artifact planeswalker with a really crazy passive effect. He will give all of your creatures affinity for artifacts, meaning their cost will be reduced by 1 generic mana for each artifact you do control. And even though we're not playing any high cost creatures in this deck, the synergy this card has with our commander is absolutely insane, because the cost reduction of the affinity will apply to the X in our commander's cost, which usually with the amount of mana rocks, artifact lands, Cybermen, and other value artifacts will boost the X value of our commander by about 10 or 20. Now that passive effect alone is the main reason why Tezzeret is included in this deck, but on top of that, his loyalty abilities are actually quite potent as well. His plus ability will make Tezzeret deal X damage to each opponent and you will gain X life. X being the amount of artifacts you control. And with the huge amount of artifacts we'll be controlling, this effect will usually deal between 10 to 20 damage to all of your opponents at once, which might actually win you the game if your opponents are already at a low life total. And the live game part on this effect can help you stabilize your life total if you are under a significant amount of pressure. His -3 ability will allow you to return any artifact card from your graveyard to your hand, which is a really solid recursion tool to just get back any sort of value artifact that over the course of the game either got milled, discarded, or removed. Mycosynth Golem, a massive 11 mana creature with affinity for artifacts, meaning that whenever we cast our Cyber Controller for the first time and generated a couple of Cybermen, meaning we will usually be able to follow up with this massive creature as early as turn 5. And the reason why this card is included is the fact that it will give all other artifact creatures we control affinity for artifacts as well, essentially functioning in exactly the same way as the passive effect of our Tezzeret. And fun fact, whenever you have both Tezzeret and this card on the battlefield, you will get double the cost reduction on your commander. Yeah, 2 instances of the affinity for artifacts mechanic do actually stack. And of course, we're also playing some more regular mana rocks like an ever-flowing chalice, which is a 0 mana artifact with the multi-kicker 2 mechanic, meaning whenever we cast it we are allowed to pay 2 generic mana any amount of times and it will enter with that many charge counters. And then whenever we tap it we get to add 1 colorless mana to our mana pool for every charge counter it has on itself. Now bottom line, this card will function as a 2 mana rock that produces 1 mana, which is already some excellent value. But the best thing about this card is the fact that it doesn't have a ceiling on how much mana it can produce for you, since whenever you draw into this later in the game and you have any cost reducers or things like an Urza or a Mammon on the battlefield, you can then pump a massive amount of mana into this card, which on a later turn will then produce you a huge amount of mana to invest in your commander's X cost. Basalt Monolith, a 3 mana artifact that will tap for 3 mana and has an activated ability that you can untap it for 3 generic mana. Now baseline, the effects on this card go break even, since you can just tap it for 3 and untap it for 3. But once you do have an effect on the battlefield that either increases the mana output of this card or reduces the cost of the activated ability, this card will easily enable you to produce an infinite amount of colorless mana, which thanks to our commander will automatically result into an instant game win. More about how we make this happen later in the video. And obviously we're also playing a bunch of basic mana rocks without any additional effects, being a Sol Ring, an Arcane Signet, a Demiurge Signet, a Mind Stone, a Talisman of Dominance, a Palladium Mirror, a Worn Power Stone, and a Tran Dynamo. While these cards don't have any fancy or flashy effects, they are really reliable tools that will allow us to cast our Cyber Controller a little bit earlier, and that later in the game will allow us to dump more mana into his X. Next up we have the support section, and these are the cards that really help everything in this deck come together. Whether it's tutoring for our key pieces, providing us with additional ways to win the game, or creating additional synergies with our Cybermen, these cards do make the entire deck more consistent and more powerful. Altar of the Brute, a 1 mana artifact that will provide us with some crazy value. Whenever any permanent would enter the battlefield under our control, each opponent will have to mill 1 card. Now I know I said this isn't a regular mill deck, but the value this card provides is just way too good not to include in the deck, because this card will be doing a huge amount of milling over the course of the game by you just playing any of your mana rocks or other artifacts. And whenever you play your commander, your opponents will have to mill equal to the X, then you will get to generate Cyberman tokens, and your opponents will then have to mill 1 card for each Cyberman generated, which will really speed up the mill clock your opponents are on, because they will be going to 0 cards in their deck really quickly now. And this effect also has an incredibly potent synergy with a card you will see later in this section, Bloodchief Ascension, arguably one of the strongest 1 mana cards in existence. is. At the beginning of each end step, it will check if any opponent lost 2 or more life this turn. If they did, you will get to put a quest counter onto Bloodchief Ascension. Now, no matter what type of deck you are playing, it is really easy to stack up on quest counters on this card because it doesn't care about the source of the life loss. It will trigger off your opponent swinging at each other, you can easily trigger it by swinging with your Cybermen, and even if an opponent is playing a Shockland paying 2 life to make it enter untapped, you will get a quest counter. And whenever you then get to 3 or more quest counters, this card's other effect comes online, which is arguably one of the most potent effects in existence. Whenever any card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, they will lose 2 life and you will get to gain 2 life. Now in itself, without even doing anything, you will get a huge amount of triggers of this ability, because creatures will always be removed, things will always be sacrificed, and people will always be cracking their fetch lands or even their evolving wilds if you're playing against any sort of budget players. But especially in this sort of mill deck, we will be able to get like 20, 30, 40 triggers out of this effect in any given turn. Because let's say you cast your Cyber Controller for 5, each opponent will have to mill 5 cards, and Bloodchief Ascension will make them lose 10 life in the process, and you will get to gain 30 life of this effect, giving you an alternate win condition by quickly draining out your opponents. And don't underestimate the massive amount of life this simple 1 mana enchantment will gain you. Unless your opponents do have a massive board state, it will be nearly impossible for them to take you out of the game. And a good interaction to know is that whenever you do mill a creature card with your Cyber Controller's effect, the creature will actually hit their graveyard first and trigger your Bloodchief Ascension, and then only after that happens, it will come to your side of the battlefield as a face down Cyberman. I really can't emphasize how broken this card is. I could probably make a 3-hour video about it. And if you want to push the power level of this deck even further, it also sets up for a really easy 2-card combo with Mindcrank, which is an artifact that whenever an opponent loses any amount of life will make them mill that many cards. And whenever you do have both on the battlefield, you just need to be able to get 1 card into an opponent's graveyard or make them lose 1 life to get the cycle started. They will lose 1 life, have to mill a card, Bloodchief's Ascension will then trigger, making them lose 2 life, mill 2, and the cycle just repeats over and over again until they either run out of life or run out of cards in their deck. But to not push the power level of this deck over the top, I did decide to exclude this combo from the deck. Drafna, Founder of Latnam, a 2-drop creature with 2 activated abilities that are both just perfect for this deck. The first ability will allow us for 2 mana to return any artifact we control to our hand on instant speed, giving you a really nice way to bounce your Cyber Controller back to your hand if you don't have any sacrifice engine available to make him go to the command zone. And if you do so, you also get to bypass any sort of commander tax you have to pay. And this ability also functions as a really nice protection tool for any value artifact you might have on the battlefield. Because if your opponent is casting a Wear and Tear targeted at your Ashnod's Altar, you can just pay 2 mana, make it go back to your hand, and the removal spell will fizzle. His second ability will for 3 mana and tapping him allow you to copy any target artifact spell on the stack. And since the copy will happen straight from the stack, if you do cast a Cyber Controller with X being 5, the copy entering will then also copy the value of the X, essentially giving you double the value if you cast your commander. Now let's get into some of the tutors we are playing in the deck. Diabolic Intent. For 2 mana and sacrificing a creature as an additional cost, we get to search our library for any card and put it into our hand. Now since we will always have Cybermen available to sacrifice to this effect, the additional cost doesn't actually matter to us, because whenever you do have your Cyber Controller on the battlefield and you have no way of making him go to the command zone because you don't have a sacrifice outlet, you can then just use your Diabolic Intent, sacrifice your commander, and you will be able to cast him again. And since this card has no restrictions on what you can tutor up, you can use it for anything you need most at the current given board state. You can go get a board wipe, counter magic, a card draw engine, or more importantly, you can use it to go fetch up your combo pieces like your Ashnod's Altar and your KCI, Moonsilver Key, a 2 mana artifact that for 1 mana and sacrificing it will allow you to go search your deck for any artifact with a mana ability and put it into your hand. And since almost all of the combo pieces in our decks are artifacts with mana abilities, this effect is just perfect to go set up your combo. It will go fetch up your KCI KCI, your Ashnod's Altar, or even your Basalt Monolith. And since this card is a low-cost artifact itself, it will even trigger any of the artifact synergies we're playing in this deck. Reshape. For 2 blue mana plus X and sacrificing an artifact, we get to search our library for any artifact card with mana value X or less and put it straight onto the battlefield. And this card functions in a really similar way as a Diabolic Intent. We will have to invest additional mana into the X, but in return it will tutor straight to the battlefield, which in this deck usually means you can start popping off with some combos immediately on the turn you cast this. Transit Mage, a 3 mana creature that whenever it enters a battlefield will go tutor up any artifact with mana value 4 or 5 from our deck to our hand, which is just the perfect card to go tutor up your KCI. Now before you ask, in the comments below I will explain you why I decided to run this card over a Trophy Mage, which is a creature with exactly the same effect, but it will tutor up a 3 mana artifact instead of 4 or 5. And the reasoning is really simple, and it's just the fact that I do think that KCI is a better tutor target than your Ashnod's Altar, because Ashnod's will only allow you to sacrifice your creatures for mana, but a KCI will even allow you to sacrifice any artifact land, any of your mana rocks, or even any of your other value artifacts if you don't need them anymore, making it a ton more efficient in producing you as much mana as possible to dump into the X of your commander whenever you need it. Repurposing Bay, a card that is essentially the artifact equivalent of a birthing pot. For 2 mana and sacrificing any other artifact you control, you get to search your library for any artifact with mana value equal to the sacrifice artifact plus 1 and put it straight onto the battlefield. And this card is just fantastic for a couple of reasons. First up, this card is an artifact itself that will stay on the battlefield, synergizing really well with all of our artifact synergies and even generating us an additional mana whenever we do have a Karn on the battlefield. It's also a repeatable effect we can use turn after turn for as long as our opponents don't have an answer to this. And lastly, the mana curve of this deck is just perfect to support this card's effect. You can turn one of your Cybermen into an Altar of the Brute to just get an additional win condition on the battlefield. You can turn any of your 2 mana rocks into an Ashnod's Altar to start a combo. My favorite thing to do is sacrifice your Cyber Controller to go fetch up your KCI, which you can then instantly use to sacrifice a bunch of artifacts, generate a huge amount of mana, and just cast your Cyber Controller from the command zone again because you sacrificed it to your Repurposing Bay. And those are just a couple of examples. There's a lot more crazy things you can do with Repurposing Bay. Crystal Shard, a 3 mana artifact with a really potent activated ability. For 1 blue mana and tapping it, we get to return any creature on the battlefield back to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1 generic mana. And we can use this effect in exactly the same way as Drafna's first ability. We can use it as a protection effect for any of our value creatures and our Cyber Controller. We can use it to get our commander back into our hand, allowing us to cast it again and even bypass any sort of commander attacks. And we can even use it to disrupt our opponents, because it will force them to always keep 1 mana open, or we will just be able to bounce any of their value creatures. Bruvak the Grandiloquent. Whenever I see this guy, I always have to think about the zooming magnifying eyeglass from the Spy Kids movies. This card is by far the most expensive card in the entire deck. And the reason for that is because no card with a similar effect to this one does exist, and it is an auto inclusion in any sort of mill strategy. If any opponent has to mill 1 or more cards, they will have to mill twice as many instead. Now in any sort of mill deck, this doubles the clock that your opponents are on because they will get milled out twice as fast. But in this deck, Bruvak has a synergy that makes him even better. And that is due to his ability being a replacement effect, meaning he will not only be doubling up on the milling our Cyber Controller will be doing whenever he enters a battlefield, but he will even double up on our Cybermen production, because the additional milling doesn't come from Bruvak himself, but it will apply to Cyber Controller's effect effect, so these two actually do work together, which makes Bruvak help us with two of the most important parts of this entire deck. Both the speed we'll be milling our opponents at and the amount of Cybermen we'll be producing. Besiege the Mirror, a 4-mana card that will allow us to go search up any card in our library and put it into our hand, and it also has the bargain mechanic, meaning that whenever we cast it we get the ability to sacrifice an artifact. When we do, if the mana value of the card we tutored up is 4 or less, we get to cast it for free. And in this deck, this card essentially functions as a second copy of your KCI, since you can just cast this card from your hand for 4 mana and it will result in you getting your KCI straight onto the battlefield. Clock of Omens, a 4-mana card that will allow you to tap 2 untapped artifacts to untap 1 target artifact. The amount of potential untaps this card will provide you is absolutely ridiculous with the amount of Cybermen we'll be controlling. And you will even be able to tap artifacts without a tap ability like your Semblance Anvil or even your Clock of Omens itself. And you can use the untaps in many different ways in this deck. You can use it to untap any of your mana rocks and just allow you to generate more mana. You can untap your Repurposing Bay to go tutor up more artifacts. You can use it to untap your Radiant Lotus, which will turn it into a similar combo sacrifice outlet like your Ashnod's Altar or your KCI. And it also has a crazy synergy with the Eternity Elevator, because you can both untap your Cybermen to get additional station triggers, and whenever you did get to 20 charge counters, you can just untap it to add an additional huge amount of mana to your mana pool. Honestly, one of the most fun cards to use in the deck that will open up a ton of creative sequencing. Master Transmuter, a 4-mana artifact creature with a similar effect to our Crystal Shard. For 1 blue mana and tapping this creature, we get to return any artifact we control to our hand, and then we get to put any artifact from our hand straight onto the battlefield, which is a very nice way to bounce our Cyber Controller, allowing us to cast it again without even paying any sort of commander tax, while at the same time also enabling us to cheat any artifact from our hand straight onto the battlefield. And a fun fact about this ability is that whenever you do bounce an artifact, you can use the second part of this effect to just put the artifact you just bounced back into play, which is really nice if you do, for example, have an Ashnod's Altar on the battlefield which an opponent is trying to destroy with a Vandal Blast. You can just activate this effect, bounce the Ashnods, put it back into play. It will be a new game object and the Vandal Blast won't have a target anymore and the spell will just fizzle. The Clone Saga, a card I honestly didn't even know existed before building this deck. The first stage of this saga will allow you to surveil 3. Honestly, not really that relevant, but I suppose it does help you set up your draws on your future turns. Now where things get really interesting are the next 2 stages. When this card gets to 2 lore counters, whenever you cast your next creature spell in this turn, you will get to copy it and the copy won't even be legendary, which obviously whenever you now cast your Cyber Controller will give you double the value because value of X does get copied, and since you will now have 2 copies of Cyber Controller on the battlefield, you get double the amount of value from his passive effect, turning all of your Cybermen into 4/4 artifact creatures. Whenever this card gets to its 3rd lore counter, you get to choose a creature name. Whenever any creature with the chosen name does deal combat damage to an opponent, you will get to draw a card. And with this effect, you will always be naming Cyberman. Thanks to this card's second effect, you will always have a huge amount of these Cyberman artifact creature tokens on the battlefield, which you can then just turn sideways, swing at your opponents with, and due to the massive size of our army, you will always get combat damage through and will draw about 5 to 10 cards from this effect. The Water Crystal, a 4-mana artifact that will reduce the cost of any blue spell you cast by 1 generic mana, which already is a really nice addition to all of the other cost reduction cards we are playing in this deck. But the real reason why this card is included is its second effect. Whenever an opponent has to mill 1 or more cards, they have to mill that many cards plus 4 instead. And just like Bruvak, this is a replacement effect, so it will scale with your Cyber Controller's Cyberman production. And this card also has an incredibly potent synergy with our Altar of the Brute, because Altar will be milling our opponents in instances of 1 card at a time. Every single one of those mill instances will be boosted to milling 5 cards. So whenever you cast your Cyber Controller and generate like 5 Cyberman tokens, 6 permanents will be entering and you will get 6 Altar of the Brute triggers. If you then have a Water Crystal on the battlefield, your opponents will have to mill an additional massive 30 cards. And since this card is an artifact itself, it is actually really easy to tutor up for us. We can use our repurposing bay, or besiege the mirror, or even your reshape if you aren't able to win the game with your KCI or your Ashnod's altar. Forsaken Monument, a 5 mana legendary artifact that will give all colorless creatures you control a +2/+2 stat boost. And just that first ability in itself already gives you an additional way to win the game on combat damage, because all of your Cybermen will suddenly be turned into massive 5/5 bodies. Now while that is quite nice, the main reason this card is included is its second ability. Whenever we tap any permanent for a colorless mana, we get to add 2 colorless mana to our mana pool instead, doubling the mana production of our colorless mana rocks, any of our lands that do produce colorless mana, and also giving us a way to generate infinite mana with our Basalt Monolith, because it will now produce us 4 colorless mana and we can untap it for just 3 colorless mana, resulting in an infinite mana loop and an instant game win with our Cyber Controller. Tezzeret the Seeker, a 5 mana planeswalker used in almost any artifact deck. His +1 ability will, just like a Clock of Omens, allow us to untap up to 2 target artifacts, which will result in us either having more mana or getting more uses out of our utility cards like a repurposing bay. His second ability allows us to remove any amount of loyalty counters of Tezzeret to go tutor up any artifact with mana value X or less straight from our deck to the battlefield, which will function in a really similar way as a reshape, just allowing us to go tutor up our KCI or our Ashnod's altar and set up for a game win. And since his ultimate ability only does require 5 loyalty, it is quite realistic we will be able to use it, and it does serve as an additional win con, because it will turn all artifacts we control, even non-creature ones, into 5/5 creatures, animating all of our mana rocks, boosting the stats of all of our Cybermen, and thanks to Cyber Controller's last passive ability, all of our creatures will have 6 power and 6 toughness, which usually will enable you to go for a lethal swing and just win the game on the spot. And before we continue, there's one more card I didn't include in the deck that I do want to talk about, because I know you guys will be asking for it in the comments, and that is Time Thief, a 2 mana artifact which you can tap and sacrifice 5 artifacts to get an extra turn. Now I'm gonna be honest, this is probably the best card you can include in this deck. With the sheer amount of artifacts we'll be controlling and all of the Cybermen will be generating turn after turn, you will just be able to chain an infinite amount of turns with this card. That being said, with the huge amount of artifact tutors we are running in the deck, including a Time Thief does feel a little oppressive, and it really does double up on the power level of this deck, and you won't be able to play it at casual tables anymore. If you do want to make the deck as competitive as possible, you can include this card by replacing one of your 2 mana rocks in this deck. But please don't include this card if you are planning to play this deck at more casual tables. Before we continue, I do have a couple of really awesome updates to share with you. The growth of the channel has been absolutely insane over the last couple of months, and thanks to that, I have finally been able to bring someone on board to help me with the editing of these videos. Some of you might even already know him from our Discord community, Kamgote, and this is actually the first video he edited for the channel. So if you enjoyed the editing in this video, make sure to show him some love in the comments below. And I also have one more really exciting piece of news. I recently became an official Dragon Shield affiliate, which honestly still feels a little surreal to say out loud. I never could have imagined that the channel would grow to a size where an awesome company like Dragon Shield would want to work with me. So a massive thanks to everyone who has been supporting me over the years. I will never take it for granted. And if you ever need any accessories like additional sleeves or playmats, you can now use the code Panzer in capital letters over on the Dragon Shield website to get a 5% discount, which at the same time will also help you support your favorite content creator. Next up, we have the card draw section, because this deck revolves around setting up one specific combo engine. Keeping our hand filled is incredibly important. These cards will help us dig through the deck, find the combo pieces that we need, and make sure we never run out of gas while the engine is running. Cut off the profits. For 2 black mana plus X, we get to draw X cards and lose X life. Since this card is an X spell, it scales incredibly well at any stage of the game. You can cast it early to just get a little bit of card advantage, or later in the game you can cast it for a massive amount to draw you a huge amount of cards and dig really deep into your deck. Now the main reason why this card is included is due to the fact that it has the casualty tree mechanic, meaning whenever we cast it we get the option to sacrifice any creature with power 3 or greater, and when we do we get to copy this spell. And since we'll always have the Cybermen available to sacrifice to this effect, it will essentially generate you double the value. Universal Surveillance. For 3 blue mana plus X we get to draw X cards. Really similar to the previous card, but this time it has the improvise mechanic, which means we can tap any artifact we control to reduce the cost of the spell by 1 generic mana. Once you do have a couple of Cybermen on the battlefield, you can tap to the improvise mechanic. The amount of cards you'll be drawing of the spell for just 3 mana will be absolutely crazy. Forensic Gadgeteer, a 3 mana detective creature that whenever we do cast an artifact spell will generate us a clue token. And with a total of 36 artifact cards in this deck, the amount of clue tokens this little 3-drop will generate you is really good. The clue tokens will even provide you additional benefits due to them having the artifact typing. You will be able to tap them to use for the improvise mechanic like for the previous card, and they will even count towards your affinity for artifacts effects. And on top of that, this creature will passively reduce any cost of an activated ability of an artifact you control by 1 generic mana, which will allow you to sacrifice the clue tokens it generated you for just 1 generic mana and instantly refill your entire hand for barely any mana. And it also enables an infinite combo with your Basalt Monolith, because whenever you now tap it, it will produce you 3 colorless mana and you get the ability that you can untap it for just 2 colorless mana, which once again will result into an instant game win if you dump an infinite amount of mana in the X cost of your commander. Utros Researchcraft, a 3 mana spacecraft that won't do anything until you get it to at least 3 charge counters, which is really easy to achieve because you only have to tap your commander or any of your Cybermen tokens to get there. Once you do, this card turns into an incredibly potent draw engine, because whenever you now cast any artifact spell you will get to draw a card, essentially turning half of your deck into cantrips, allowing you to dig really deep into your library, and whenever you do cast an artifact, this card will also get an additional charge counter. Once you get to 12 charge counters, it will turn into a flying creature with power equal to the amount of artifacts you do control. Now the main reason this card is in the deck is just its awesome card draw ability, but I suppose later in the game you can use this card to just hit your opponents for like 20 damage in the air. And a card with a really similar effect is Veldalken Archmage, a 4-drop creature that will also draw you a card whenever you cast an artifact spell. Now while I do prefer the spacecraft version of this card because it will cost you 1 mana less and it's harder to interact with for your opponents, the more of these card draw engines we can include in the deck the better. Thoughtcast, a 5 mana spell that will draw you 2 cards, which is some pretty horrible value. But thanks to this card having affinity for artifacts, you will usually be able to cast this for just 1 blue mana, which turns it from one of the most inefficient cards into one of the most potent one-time draw effects we have available to us. Kindred Discovery, a 5 mana enchantment that whenever it enters the battlefield will make us choose a creature type, and obviously we'll be naming Cyberman. Whenever any creature of the chosen type either enters the battlefield or attacks, we will get to draw a card, which means that whenever we now cast our Cyber Controller and start generating Cyberman creatures, will generate us an insane amount of card draw, allowing us to dig really deep into our deck. And my favorite part about this card is that it will generate you some immediate value if you just have a couple of Cybermen on the battlefield. Because let's say you already cast your Cyber Controller for the first time on turn 4 and you then follow up with this enchantment on turn 5. You can then instantly swing with the 3 or 4 Cybermen you already have on the battlefield and you will get some immediate card advantage. Your creatures won't even have to connect to your opponent since it is an attack trigger and not a combat damage trigger. Shimmer Dragon, a a 6 mana flying creature that will get the hexproof keyword for as long as you control 4 or more artifacts, which trust me, in this deck will always be the case, making it into a value engine that's impossible to target with any sort of spot removal by your opponents. And the reason I say it's a value engine is due to its last ability, which allows you to tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to draw a card, allowing you to turn all of your mana rocks into cards, allowing you to even tap any of your artifacts without a tap ability to get additional cards in your hand. And once you do have a gazillion Cybermen on the battlefield, you can use this effect to dig really deep into your deck and find the options you need. Staff of Eden, a 6 mana artifact that whenever it enters a battlefield allows you to pick any legendary permanent in a graveyard and put it onto the battlefield under your control. Now, due to the effect of the Cyber Controller putting any creature that's milled on the battlefield as a Cyberman, it is pretty unlikely you'll be hitting legendary creatures with this effect. That being said, there are a ton of legendary options that aren't creatures you can reanimate with this, be it a Great Henge, any legendary land that's going to an opponent's graveyard, or you can even use it to steal your opponent's one ring you just milled. Now, even if you aren't able to get any good targets with this effect, the main reason it is included is its activated ability, which is that you can tap this artifact to draw 1 card for each permanent you control but you don't own. And this criteria will apply to every Cyberman you have on the battlefield, essentially making this card read, tap this artifact, draw 1 card per Cyberman you control. And if you do have a Clock of Omens on the battlefield, you can just untap this card and do it all over again. And the last card in this section is a Thought Monitor, a 6 mana creature with affinity for artifacts that will draw you 2 cards whenever it enters the battlefield, functioning in exactly the same way as a Thoughtcast, drawing you 2 cards for just 1 mana, while on top of that giving you an additional artifact body that will trigger all of your artifact synergies you can use for the improvise mechanic and will give you an even further cost reduction for any sort of affinity card you're about to play. Next up, we have the protection and the interaction. The longer the game goes on, the better this deck actually gets, because we will have more mana and resources available to us. These cards will help us deal with whatever our opponents are doing, stop them from disrupting our combo engine, and will make sure we can actually get to the point where we can start our combo. An offer you can't refuse. For 1 blue mana, we get to counter target non-creature spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get to generate 2 treasure tokens. This card is simply one of the most efficient counter spells in existence, because it gives you a 1 mana card to stop any sort of board wipe, any sort of counter spell targeted at your combo, or any sort of removal spell targeted at your value engines. And usually the fact that you are giving your opponents 2 measly treasure tokens in return doesn't really matter, because you were just able to protect your own combo or stop their combo from being used for just 1 mana. And now that we're on the topic of really efficient counter spells, Swan Song. For 1 mana you get to counter either target enchantment, sorcery, or instant speed spell, but in return the controller of that spell will get to generate a 2/2 bird token with flying, arguably making this card even better than the previous one, because the small burp token is even more irrelevant than the treasures. Rapid Hybridization. For 1 blue mana on instant speed you get to destroy any target creature on the battlefield, but the controller of that creature will get to generate a 3/3 creature token. This is basically the blue version of a Swords to Plowshares or a Path to Exile, giving you access to a really cost-efficient instant speed effect that allows you to deal with any sort of problematic commander or creature on the battlefield, which is really excellent against some commander-specific decks like a Balin, a Krenko, or even things like a Sephiroth. Malakir Rebirth. For 1 mana and 2 life on instant speed, you get to give any creature you control an additional line of text. Whenever this creature would die, you get to return it to the battlefield tapped instead. Now, while we don't really care about using protection tools on our commander, since we're totally fine if he goes to the command zone, it is a really nice way to protect any of our other value creatures like our Bruvak or our Urza. And this card is also an MDFC land card, meaning that whenever we don't need its effect, we can just play the backside, which is a land card that will tap for mana. As for any of these MDFC CFC cards, you should view them as lands first that do have an additional effect whenever you draw into them later in the game and you don't need the lands anymore. Drown in the Loch, a 2-mana instant speed spell that will allow you to choose one out of its 2 options. The first option will allow you to counter target spell with mana value X or less, X being the amount of cards in target opponent's graveyard, and the second option will allow you to destroy any creature on the battlefield with mana value X or less, X also being the amount of cards in that opponent's graveyard. And since we'll always be milling our opponents, this card essentially reads for 2 mana either destroy any creature on the field or just counter any spell, making it into one of the most versatile interaction options we have available to us in this deck. Feed the Swarm. For 2 mana we get to destroy either target enchantment or creature and we will lose life equal to the converted mana cost of that card. Now while this card will take a huge chunk of life out of our life total if we do target something big with it, since we are in Dimir colors we don't really have that many options available to us to actually deal with enchantments, and this card totally solves that problem. Nothing feels as bad as an opponent having a Smothering Tide on the battlefield and no one at the table having any tools available to deal with it. Boggart Trawler, a 3-mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield allows us to exile any opponent's graveyard. And even though Cyber Controller already makes sure that we can keep creatures out of our opponent's graveyards, we still do need ways to deal with graveyard-based decks. Because whenever a Reanimator player is just entombing their Elesh Norn bypassing our commander's restriction, or a Spellslinger player is about to cast a Past in Flames and recast their entire graveyard, this simple 3-mana creature will stop all of that from happening and will actually just shut down their entire decks. And just like a Malaki Rebirth, if you don't need the effect of this card, you can just play the backside, which is a land that taps for black mana and even enters untapped at a low cost of 3 life. And like I mentioned, the longer the game goes on, the better this deck actually gets, so we are playing a ton of board wipes. The first one, and probably the most efficient one, being a Toxic Deluge. For 3 mana and paying X life, every creature on the battlefield will get -X until the end of turn. And the amount of versatility that a Toxic Deluge brings to the table is just insane. You can cast this early in the game for just 2 life if you're playing against a token deck to just clear their entire board, or later in the game if your opponents have like big 8 toughness dragon creatures on the field, you can just pay more life and still use it as a wipe to clear the entire board. Life is a resource anyways, people, use it. Phyrexian Scriptures. The first stage of this card will allow you to put a +1/+1 counter on any creature and it will become an artifact in addition to its other types, which is a nice way to turn any of your really valuable value creatures that aren't artifacts like your Urza or your Bruvak into actual artifacts, which will protect them from the second stage of this card. That simply reads, destroy all non-artifact creatures. Unless you are playing in a pot with other artifact players, will just function as a one-sided board wipe, just resetting anything your opponents have built up over the early turns in the game, and also making sure they won't have any blockers and you can go in for a huge swing with your Cybermen, sometimes even taking an opponent out of the game. And the third stage is the reason why I love this card so much. It will exile each opponent's graveyard, which, just like I mentioned, is an excellent thing to do in a mill deck. Nowadays in modern day Magic, every deck is playing some sort of graveyard recursion, and since we will be milling our opponents, we don't really want to get a ton of cards in their graveyard that they can take advantage of later in the game. And this card will just solve that entire problem on top of being a one-sided board wipe. The only real downside to this card is the fact that it doesn't have an immediate effect whenever you cast it. You do have to wait for it to get to its second stage. Teresiari's Devastation. For 4 mana plus X you lose X life and then you get to generate X tapped Power Stone tokens, which are simple artifacts you can tap to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. And after those tokens are created, all creatures on the battlefield will get -X, X being the amount of artifacts you control. Now this card is fantastic for 2 reasons. First up, it does act as some sort of an acceleration spell, because it will generate you a bunch of Power Stone tokens you can use on a later turn to dump mana into the X cost of your commander. And the second part of this card will always be a guaranteed board wipe, because with the huge amount of artifacts we'll be controlling, it will destroy everything, even the biggest creatures. And the fact that it does give -1 toughness and it's not a destroy effect will make sure this card even deals with things with the indestructible keyword. Singularity Rupture, a board wipe that's just made for mill decks. For 6 mana you get to destroy all creatures on the battlefield, and then any amount of target players will have to mill half of their library rounded down. Now first up, paying 6 mana for a board wipe in this deck isn't really that big of a deal. As you've seen, we are playing a huge amount of mana rocks and we will be able to cast a big card like this as early as turn 4. But whenever we do compare this card to a classic efficient Damnation, this card just gives us some incredible value for just 2 more mana. Because once you halve the size of your opponent's libraries, you will only need to dump half as much mana into the X of your commander to actually win the game with him. And since I know this interaction will come up in the comments, no, this card doesn't work with Bruvak, because this card will first destroy all creatures including Bruvak, and then the mill effect will trigger, so Bruvak's mill doubling won't just win you the game on the spot. And that's the reason why I included Malaki Rebirth in this deck, because you can just have your Bruvak on the field, cast a Malaki Rebirth on him, then resolve your Singularity Rupture, everything will die, Bruvak will return, the mill effect will then happen, and your opponents will have to mill half their library times 2, resulting in an instant game win. Pretty awesome interaction. Their name is Death, a 6 mana card that has exactly the same effect as the second stage of our Fraction Scriptures, destroying all non-artifact creatures, acting as a one-sided board wipe that will allow you to swing with your Cybermen creatures at your opponents, and that will be really easy to cast thanks to all of our mana acceleration. And the last card in this section is a Demonic Chunker, a 7 mana creature that whenever it enters the battlefield will allow us to destroy up to 1 creature for each opponent. And thanks to this card having affinity for artifacts, it becomes one of the most efficient removal spells in the deck. Essentially reading, pay 1 mana, destroy 3 creatures. Another pretty cool card I didn't even know existed before building this deck. And last up we have the mana base. We are running a couple of utility lands, so I'll start by going over those. Archway of Innovation. For 1 blue mana and tapping this land, we can give the next spell we cast this turn the Improvise mechanic, which is just incredible with any of our X spells and especially our commander, because now we will be able to tap treasure tokens, clue tokens, power stones, and our massive army of 7 billion Cybermen to help pay for the X cost of our commander. And it's pretty common, this simple land will allow you to cast your commander for like 20, 30, 40 mana, which is absolutely nuts. Buried Ruin, a land we can sacrifice for 2 generic mana to return any artifact from our graveyard to our hand. A very simple but solid recursion tool we can use to get back any value artifact that over the course of the game got removed, milled, or discarded. Fomori Vault. For 3 mana, tapping this land and discarding a card, we get to activate its ability, which will allow us to look at the top X cards of our library, X being the amount of artifacts we control. Then we get to pick one of those cards, put it in our hand, and the rest just goes to the bottom of our deck. Now whenever you do get to the mid or the late game and you activate this card, you will be able to dig like 20 or 30 cards deep into your deck, which will easily enable you to find any of your combo pieces and set up for a game win. Inventor's Fair, a legendary land that at the beginning of your upkeep will gain you 1 life if you do control 3 or more artifacts. And the real kicker of this card is its activated ability. For 4 mana and sacrificing it, you get to search your library for any artifact card and put it into your hand, acting as an additional tutor card on something as simple as a land that will allow us to go find the exact piece we need to start closing out the game with. Fraction Tower. This land will tap for either a colorless mana, or we can can tap it to sacrifice a creature to add 2 black mana to our mana pool. Now first up, this is a land that will essentially tap for 2 mana because we will always have Cybermen creatures on the battlefield to sacrifice to its effect. But the main reason why this card is included in the deck is the fact that it gives us an additional sacrifice outlet for our Cyber Controller. Because if you have 7 gazillion mana available to you to dump into the X of Cyber Controller, it doesn't actually matter if he's on the battlefield and you aren't able to make him return to the command zone to recast again. 3/3 City. Whenever this land enters a battlefield, we have to choose a creature type. Once again, we'll be naming Cyberman. Then for 2 generic mana and tapping it, we get to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool for each creature we control of the selected type. And since the entire purpose of this deck is just generating as much Cyberman as possible, the amount of mana this land will generate you is just bananas. And just the fact that it will even produce you mana of one specific color will really help you out with the color fixing of the 3 colored pips you need for the Cyber Controller. Utros, Titanic Godcore, the blue planet card we got in the Edge of Eternity set. It's a land that enters the battlefield tapped and it has the station mechanic. And just like I mentioned throughout the video, stationing cards in this deck is a really easy thing to do with all of the Cybermen you'll be generating. And once this card gets to 12 charge counters, meaning you have to tap 4 Cybermen for it, it gets an additional ability that allows you to tap it to add 1 blue mana to your mana pool for every artifact you control, which makes it into an effect that's even more potent as a 3/3 city, because it won't only take into account all of the Cybermen you control, but also all of your mana rocks, other value artifacts, and all of the artifact tokens you might have on the battlefield. And for the regular mana producing lands, we're playing a Pathway, a Command Tower, a Fast Land, a Darkwater Catacombs, a Check Land, a Verge Land, a River of Tears, a Slow Land, a Spire of Industry, a Filter Land, an Underground River, a Shock Land, 3 artifact lands, and for basics we're playing 6 islands and 3 swamps. And that's it for my in-depth The Cyber Controller deck. A very under the radar commander that turns mill into a viable strategy, gives us a massive board presence while doing so, and will eventually snowball into a combo engine once everything gets going. It's an incredibly unique deck, and once the sacrifice engine is online, things spiral out of control really fast. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, let me know by dropping a robot emoji in the comments below. Share this video with every Magic player in your local game store, hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon so you won't miss next week's upload. Thanks for watching, enjoy turning your opponent's libraries into your own personal robot army, and I will see you in the next one.